the World Health Organization Independent Panel for Pandemic Preparedness and Response, Helen, Clarke, and Foreign Policy's Andrew Solinger for a conversation on building a stronger pandemic response.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. You've had a few snacks, healthy snacks, and hopefully refreshed, and you're paying attention. So I want to remind you, this is our last section of today's program. We're going to talk about pandemic preparedness, AMR, and if you're patient, there will be a drinks reception in an hour and a half or so, sponsored by our partners JSK and Guard P. So please do stick around for that. Very excited to have this conversation with the Honourable Helen Clarke, former Prime Minister of New Zealand. And it's very important and poignant what we're talking about. We're talking about building a strong pandemic response, something that needs some attention. Of course, the pandemic exposed vulnerabilities globally and heightened awareness for greater preparedness for global emergencies. And we have failed to advance a multi-stakeholder response to prepare for that. And we're putting billions of lives at risk and a lot of treasure as well. So we need to work on that immediately, especially because pandemic threats are intensifying. Climate, we were talking about that earlier, is part of the culprit, as is AMR resistance. So AMR problems. So we have to really be more proactive and have a sustained effort by policymakers and funders and the industry and practitioners to mitigate risks. So we're going to talk about that today with Helen, who, in addition to all of the great things that she's done, she was co-chair of the Independent Panel for Pandemic Preparedness and Response, the IPPR. So we have the great person here to talk about these issues with. So thank you so much for joining us. So in 2021, you and the great Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, along with others, the IPPR, laid out a series of concrete recommendations to transform health systems to mitigate risks from future pandemics. That was 3 years ago. Earlier this year, you issued a new report called No Time to Gamble, Taking Stock of Leaders' Progress. How's progress, Helen?
Well, I think you look at what's been happening over MPOX and you'd have to conclude that we haven't learned a lot. Same old issues, vaccine inequity, lack of readiness, etc. So what's kind of gone wrong? Firstly, with pandemics, you go through a cycle of utter panic, which is where we were in 2020, and certainly probably well into 2021 for many countries. And then you go into a cycle of neglect. And then I think there's been a bit of a tendency, particularly in the high-income countries, to think that pandemics are things that happen somewhere else. COVID was one that got away and engulfed the world, but MPOX, well, it's kind of over there, so the reaction doesn't come as quickly as it might. Now, so where do we stand now? In some ways, worse off, because COVID stripped out countries of all income levels of fiscal space, right? We all dug in the high-income countries very deep into our pockets. We don't have a lot of fiscal space. We're trying to make some of it up again. And for many of the low-income countries, low-middle-income countries, the fiscal effects are quite devastating, and just simply increase your indebtedness and economic fragility. And the other thing that's worse is that the longer COVID went on, the more the vaccine skeptics and the science deniers got a bit of a hold. Yeah. So going into another pandemic, would we as readily get vaccine uptake as we did? I have to pose that question. It also raises issues about whether we can get as widespread childhood vaccinations as we used to getting if science distrust grows. So there's those background things. Now, in other areas, we called for dedicated preparedness finance and surge finance. No sign of the surge finance, by the way. You need a mechanism where you can scale up really quickly, and it's thought to the tune of about $100 billion when a pandemic strikes. But go back the step before that. It was estimated you need about $10.5 billion every year in solidarity funding to support low and middle income countries to be really prepared. Now, the pandemic fund was set up. It hasn't gathered $10.5 billion a year. It's gathered somewhat under $3 billion once, I think, and it's vastly oversubscribed every time it took out a call. So the money isn't there. I mean, our panel and, of course, very keen group of advocates around global public investment say the model's wrong, that when we go to finance global public goods like pandemic preparedness, we need a different formula altogether, from each according to their means, each according to their needs, where everybody pays into vertical fund for this purpose, but then you get out according to your needs. Well, that hasn't happened. Okay, secondly, on new legal measures, we do have new international health regulations, and they do improve things a bit. But let's see how quickly member states get to implement them. They come into effect in May next year, and countries really need to put a lot of effort in now to making sure they've got the capacity to do the new regs. The pandemic accord negotiations in Geneva, well, they go on, and they go on. I don't think they're going to agree this year. They could. It's all political will. But, cycle of panic and neglect, leaders' attention is somewhere else. So then come to the issue of WHO financing, which we raised. Woefully financed. As is commonly said, the WHO has about as big a budget as a large New York City hospital. Well, that's not much for Global Health Organization. No. And WHO is in the most brutal round of internal cuts at the moment, because it's strapped for cash, and it shouldn't be strapped for cash. We need to support it to do its job. The last point I'll make is on the countermeasures, medical countermeasures in the event that pandemic strikes. You've got to have the diagnostics, you've got to have the therapeutics, you've got to have the vaccines, and of course the oxygen, the PPE, and the rest of it. And I mean, these are really the issues that the global negotiations found are over, because our high-income countries really do protect IP and pharmaceutical companies, not to put too clear a point on it. In a pandemic, we've got to share knowledge. We're talking about an existential threat, but we're not geared up for that. TRIPS waivers. Has there ever been a TRIPS waiver? There was never one for HIV. We've got no way of really getting these things moving fast when we face a common threat.
So let's talk about that a little bit. But if I'm hearing you correctly, so other than a few things, we're doing great. Is that what you're saying? That's very discouraging, and I know that's why you're in all seriousness. That's why you are beating the drum. People, we need to wake up. Yeah. So thank you for doing that. But let's dig into a few of these things. In the wake of COVID, that is part of what we need to do about sharing IP and sharing knowledge is giving rapid access to pathogens, viruses and bacteria. That becomes essential for developing vaccines and treatments for effective responses. But now countries are concerned. Why should I share my pathogens with you? You're not going to share any of your IP, and we're not going to get any funding or any material benefits. So we're at this loggerheads. So the sharing of outbreak surveillance information, as well as the sharing of actual samples and genetic sequences, have been a major topic in reforms. What has been the progress? What can we do? What challenges are in the way?
Well, this is the sticking point, right? What's called the PABS blockage in negotiations, pathogen access and benefit sharing. And you're right. Low and middle income countries are saying, look, you people are demanding access to the pathogen information and sequencing and so on, but then you go away and develop these responses to it with a vaccine or therapeutics or whatever, and you don't share it. So why should we give it to you? You should pay for that access. And that's based on, of course, a precedent, I think, in the Nagoya Protocol and the Biodiversity Convention. And then the rich countries saying, oh, no, we're not going to pay you for it. You should put it into the pool. And the lower middle-income countries are saying, yeah, but you wanted the pool, but you don't want to help us. So we've gone round and round in circles on this, and that's what the talks will founder on, unless there's political will to move somewhere on it.
And how do we break that? There's got to be some type of middle ground.
Well, okay, so if high-income countries dig in on not paying for the access, and low-income countries say, well, tough, that the impasse continues. But are there creative ways around it? Is there a large, global common good fund which would say that in the event of the worst happening, there can be access bought? But there's actually a more fundamental issue that we raise with 45 seconds to go.
That clock's broken. Don't pay attention to it.
And that is, we need a different ecosystem. We are so dependent at the moment on by and large, the large pharmaceutical companies of the North doing things. Yes, there are big players in the global south. You know, India has big players with vaccines, therapeutics. Brazil has big. China has quite big. So you still need more centres of research and development in the global south, if I can use that term, which are linked to a manufacturing capacity, which are then linked to finance for rapid scale-up if the worst happens. And the WHO is onto something with that establishment of the mRNA hub-and-spoke arrangement, which should, our report said, be expanded to other technologies. But you know, the outfits that are trying to get into the R&D in the south are finding it very hard to get access to the money to really, you know, make it a going concern. And the thing about pandemic readiness is it's like the dog that didn't bark. You know, look, for a lot of the world, the dog hadn't barked on a pandemic since the 1918 flu pandemic. Yeah. Right? So there's kind of old cycle of panic and neglect. But if we don't learn the lessons from what happened with COVID, we will be blindsided again. And you're right, the zoonotic spillover events, you know, these zoonotic diseases are coming at us thick and fast, and you need just that whatever unique trigger of combination of factors which will send something global rather than confine it to a discrete geographical area.
Yeah, I completely agree with you on that. I told you I wanted to end on a positive note, but let's not do that. At the Summit of the Future, the Pact for the Future was supposed to include emergency platforms designed to rapidly coordinate global responses to pandemics and climate disasters. This just came out. Did that happen, or were they stripped out?
Stripped out. Look, let's not go into the long history of the Pact for the Future, but you know, the Secretary General and his team, they've done quite a thorough job leading up to this. They appointed a high-level panel, which Ellen Johnson-Sirleaf was also co-chair of that, and that panel made some good recommendations about the future agenda. The SG's teams put out a series of briefs, including around emergency platform and complex shocks. And then that was to feed into the negotiations for the Pact for the Future, and eventually it got stripped out. Now, in my humble opinion, he should have just done it, right? I mean, once you ask, then you leave it to member states to play with the negotiations. Yeah. They strip it out, and we've now got a pretty meaningless, really, reference in the Pact for the Future to we will consider how we will approach responding to complex shocks. Well, great. I think what we can say about the Pact for the Future overall is it touches on a lot of very important areas, but it touches on them. It provides hooks if you've got determined diplomats in countries who want to pick up these hooks and say we're going to put some well, this tree and make it a Christmas tree with a dressing. But at the moment, it's a bit of a skeleton.
Well, I'll add a little positive note, and the positive note is that Helen Clarke is sounding the alarm on that and not letting these guys run away without taking responsibility for that. So let's keep doing that. Thank you for joining us to give you your frank opinions on that. We appreciate it.